Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guest on this next interview. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says the latest Russian missile and drone assault on Kyiv is further proof that existing sanctions are failing to cripple Moscow's war machine. At the same time, the White House says a potential reduction of U.S. troops in Europe, quote, should not come as a surprise, raising new questions about deterrence and allied resolve. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss the implications is Olena Lennon, assistant professor in the Department of National Security at the University of New Haven. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
So I would like to kick things off with a statement from the Ukrainian president. What does President Zelenskyy mean and when he argues that the sanctions are not working despite years of Western restrictions on Russia?
Well, he means that Russia, continues to execute this, maximalist military campaign, and that sanctions have not been able to deny Russia an ability to rebuild its military machine. Hence, the so-called Ukrainian long-range sanctions, meaning these long-range drone strikes, particularly the one that Ukraine executed last night. That was one of the largest drone strikes on Russia that showed that Russian air defense is not impenetrable and that, Ukraine can, in fact, close that capability gap and deny Russia an ability to leverage its numerical advantage over Ukraine. That the war has reached a stage where Russia's size has actually been turned against it, and Ukraine is now turning Russia's massive landmass into a strategic disadvantage by showing that Russia is unable to defend its air and defend its military and civilian infrastructure, and that Ukraine is capable now of producing homemade drones and long-range drones and missiles that can create the effect of sanctions that are otherwise not working. So these are sanctions Ukrainian style, so to speak, and President Zelenskyy is trying to signal to Russia and Western partners that Ukraine no longer needs anybody's permission and to execute these strikes, and that the war of attrition continues. And in the same way that Russia is trying to exhaust Ukraine, the only way Ukraine can survive is by creating a proportional response and by exhausting Russia's military machine. And the only way to do so is the actual physical destruction of Russia's military production sites, as opposed to financial sanctions that, as we have seen in the past 4 years, are just not working.
Right. So if Western allies want to make any meaningful contribution to actually cripple Russia's economy through financial means, how should they go about it? We're talking about secondary sanctions or full embargoes?
Well, it's not, one or two or three things, right? It's all of that combined. It's all hands on deck, right? So it's a combination of secondary sanctions. It's a combination of asset freezes. It's a combination of embargoes. But more importantly, the number one player here that continues to enable Russian economy and military machine is China. Of course, going after Chinese deliveries to Russia of military components and China's ability or willingness to buy inexpensive Russian energy continue to create a significant impediment to the effectiveness of financial sanctions. And, it's a very intricate geopolitical game of creating the right incentives for the Chinese as well as the Iranians, while at the same time continuing to impose sanctions on secondary providers, as well as continue supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian ability to not just defend its own cities, but also physically destroy Russian military infrastructure and deny Russia an ability to leverage its physical power against civilians in Ukraine.
Right. And on the flip side of things, like you mentioned earlier, Ukraine is carrying out its own form of what they call effective sanction, meaning striking Russia's oil and energy infrastructure that is filling its own war coffer. Compared to perhaps the only just economic means, how effective are these these military operations doing when it comes to actually stopping Russia, when it comes to really making a dent in their war coffer, war chest, their economy?
Well, it's it's the only thing that's effective because it's not like I said, it's the language that Russia speaks was executing this aggressive war against Ukraine is the only thing that works. Because at the end of the day, the goal here is to deny Russia an ability to execute its aggressive war against Ukraine because political mechanisms, political methods have failed. Political diplomacy has failed to convince to talk Putin out of it. So the only component that, the only part of that equation that Ukraine is still able to change is actually decrease Russia's ability to execute on its maximalist ideas, genocidal ideas. They're not entirely effective. Of course, Ukraine is only able to inflict so much damage on Russia while also protecting its own cities and its own population. But like I said, it's all hands on deck. It's a combination of political, military, economic, and diplomatic factors. But Russia's cynical attack after the so-called ceasefire, from May 9th to May 11th, showed the extent to which Russia ignores any norms and principles by first asking for a ceasefire to hold the parade and then unleashing 3 days worth of explosives on Ukraine in 24 hours. Again, that was just another way of showing that the only language that works right now is the language of military power and destruction that Ukraine can actually leverage against Russia to deny them an ability to kill Ukrainian civilians.
All right, now switching the topic to the recent announcement from the White House, they're saying it's like, withdrawing some U.S. troops from Europe should not come as a surprise. Of course, this is along the lines of Trump's policy of forcing Europe to have to step up to carry out its own defense. But do you think that what kind of signal does he think that it sends both to not just the European allies, but also the adversaries in the name of Russia?
Right. Well, just because it's not surprising doesn't mean that it's not a big deal, right? It's still quite a significant development with the U.S. gradually downsizing its military footprint in Europe. Yes, you're right. It is part of an ongoing kind of agenda that the Trump administration started at least a year ago of forcing Europe to be more autonomous in its defense and self-reliant. But I think that the events in Iran definitely created an additional stimulus. Trump took, European unwillingness to support a military operation in Iran as almost as a personal grievance against Europe. He's quite vengeful and he operates in a system where personal loyalty means a lot to him. Trump is a personalist leader, so he expects favors and loyalty from other leaders. So I think he really took it personally that Spain, Italy, Germany in particular refused to provide the amount of military cooperation that he expected in Iran. And I think that now the additional drawdown of troops in Poland and Germany are, the continuation of the same policy. But at the same time, I think the war in Iran and Europeans' unwillingness and open criticism of the U.S.'s actions in Iran definitely created that additional incentive for the U.S. to sort of send us, not punish Europeans necessarily, but send a strong signal that they're going in different directions and that the U.S. increasingly sees its geopolitical ambitions in the Middle East and Indo-Pacific as a unilateral foreign policy in which Europeans will not be on America's side.
Right. Do you think this will create a sort of a ripple or a domino effect that would then affect Ukraine in the sense that if the U.S. reduces its military footprint in Europe, meaning that Europe have to take care of its own defense, which might lead to a reduction of how much they can support Ukraine? Is that a legitimate worry?
Absolutely. And in fact, I wouldn't use a future tense here. It has already happened because even the massive strikes on Ukraine in recent days showed a significant shortage in air defense missiles that Ukraine has. They're still continuing to intercept the majority of airborne target threats. But as we saw with post May 9th attacks, how many of ballistic missiles and drones actually landed. Again, this is a direct manifestation of air defense shortages in Ukraine, and these shortages are in no small part a result of an increasing demand in Europe and the Middle East for the same Patriot missile systems and other air defense systems. So the Ukraine has already, it has taken a toll on Ukraine, and the war, the European, the multiple dilemmas that have been imposed on Europeans and Middle Eastern countries have definitely diverted attention from Ukraine, and Ukraine is already suffering the consequences of that in a very direct way. The Ukrainian people are dying as a result of air defense shortages. So absolutely, these multiple conflicts and the diversion of European attention and the fear and concern of not being able to defend their own skies, hoarding their own air defense capabilities, has created a very direct effect on Ukraine's ability to defend itself, and also why Ukraine is being more aggressive in imposing its own long-range sanctions on Russia, because they understand that in the current geopolitical, in the current security environment, Ukraine has to act decisively without waiting for help from others.
Right. Last but not least, just a couple of weeks ago, there are still discussions about a negotiation, about diplomatic solutions, being peace talk, be it any sort of Trump-mediated ceasefire. Do you think that with these increased strikes from Russia hitting Ukraine and Ukraine hitting into Moscow, these diplomatic solution would be, well, are we stepping farther away from that than before?
Well, we've always been quite far away from it. But yes, absolutely. I think that Russia's attacks on after May 9th have been a very cynical demonstration that Russia's objectives remain the same, and that Russia is keen on denying Ukraine an ability to be a viable state. And Ukraine's objectives also remain the same. It needs to survive as an independent state. So political objectives have not changed. And I think the current escalation in the Middle East and between Russia and Ukraine have shown that, in today's day and age, in the current political environment and security environment, with so many irreconcilable political objectives, the only solution is really air defense. That countries are now, to survive, states must be able to protect their skies. Because political objectives are, especially between Russia and Ukraine, are entirely irreconcilable. And I think that further proof of that is Russia's recent announcement of easing of Russian passport restrictions for residents of Transnistria in Moldova, showing that Russia is trying to build that land bridge with Moldova and deny Ukraine access to Black Sea and deny ability to trade. So Russia is still at it. They're still trying to put a chokehold around Ukraine's economy and its ability to survive as a state. And Ukraine is still trying to survive. So these are non-negotiable positions, and the war of attrition continues.
All right, indeed. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.